So let's talk about revenue projections. This is the most complicated I'm going to get to, in terms of mathematics. So I think you should be fine. Revenues equals price times volume. The issue is figuring out what price is and figuring out what volume is. That's what a revenue projection is going to be like. So let's start with neither price nor volume. But in order to measure volume, we're going to have to figure out what it is that we're measuring. This is obvious in some circumstances, but it's not totally obvious in other circumstances. Some businesses are very simple in the sense that every customer looks roughly the same. Some businesses, every customer looks very different, and we're going to start having to define something like an average customer. We can be more sophisticated, but just defining what an average customer is a good starting point. So how would we do this? So I just threw up a few examples where we have to think, how are we going to count our customers? Well, in a museum, it's pretty easy. People often don't come back to a museum, so at least in a simple world. So we're just going to count the number of visitors in our museum on a particular day, week, or year. When we're going to go to a restaurant, and in a museum, everybody pays the same. So maybe we're going to account for the fact that there's some discounted prices and some regular ticket prices. Now, if we're going to a restaurant, we're also going to count, well, how many customers do we come? It's a bit more complicated because some customers eat 3 courses, others eat 1 course, so, and they all pay different prices. So we're going to have to work harder in saying the typical customer in my restaurant is going to pay £15 or £25 or £5 or whatever it is. So we have to think a little more about it. Now this is great, but let's go to a different world, an online newspaper. Oh, well that's very different because I can't just count the number of people coming into my restaurant because it's a completely different business model. So you probably have to think about the number of annual subscriptions, plus the fact that half of the people want to have the content for free. And so our unit in which we're going to count our revenue is very different. Online video game, it sounds like the same like online newspaper. No, it's not, because in the online video game, there are all these additional revenues that players get from buying additional features and, you know, special hats and costumes and swords and so on. So we're going to again struggle with just defining it. What is the unit that we're selling, because we're selling more than one product. Nuclear power station now gets really interested. How are we going to do that? Well, first is we're going to have an incredibly long horizon, obviously, but we're going to have to say what's the unit that we're selling, and then you have incredibly varying prices in the energy market. So, you know, you're obviously selling kilowatt hours or something like that, but at very different prices. Fashion consultant. Now, here's an interesting one. How are we going to build a revenue model with prices and quantities for a fashion consultant? Because a fashion consultant might just have 3 or 4 clients. And so we really have to think of the unit as a contract. But some contracts are going to be relatively short engagements. Some of them are going to be long-term engagements where I'm going to work a lot with one particular client. So we're going to it's going to challenge us to think really hard about our business, to even think, how do I think about different customers? Military subcontractors kind of actually similar, except that in that case, in the case of military subcontractor, you typically have one client. So there's really no meaningful, often it's just one contract, and you're trying to figure out what's that contract worth. The point I'm trying to make is, you look at these industries, there's huge differences in how we define the unit of analysis. Now, once we've defined the unit of analysis, we can use relatively similar techniques across all industries. And we're going to start by estimating prices. This is basically the question, what can I charge to my typical customer? This could be the person coming through the museum, through the restaurant. It could be the online subscription price. How do I do that? Well, there are different methods for coming up with an assumption of what we think is a price that our typical customer is going to pay. By the way, if you want to get more sophisticated, you recognize the fact that different customers have different willingness to pay, and you don't have to do the average customer, you can do sort of different customer profiles. But I'm trying to keep it simple for now. One customer. I can basically have a very customer-centric view that says, What value am I bringing to this customer? What is his or her willingness to pay? This could be if you're selling to businesses, in order to assess their willingness to pay, you might do a slightly more complicated calculation where you're going to prove them, this is how much money I'm saving you, and therefore you should be willing to pay me half of your savings. We call that a return on investment logic, where if you buy this, as a corporation, you're going to get a return on investment. That's typically not how you would think in a business that's selling directly to consumers, but you still worry about the basic question, what is their willingness to pay? You definitely want to segment your customers because the willingness to pay is going to differ between the early adopters and the mass market, say. There are different logics, though, and I'm just giving you a way of thinking about them, and you're going to mix these ways in coming up with your best estimate. Another very different one is sort of a competitor-based logic. Think of a spectrum of cost or prices, I could have said here. Think of a spectrum of the prices people are willing to pay as a function of quality. Think of hotels. Well, so what you're going to do is you can say, well, people obviously want a place to stay overnight, so there's a willingness to pay, but the prices I'm going to be able to charge are largely determined by the sort of price-quality trade-off that's in the industry. So I'm going to have a real cheap motel. Well, there's no way I'm going to charge more than the Four Seasons, so my pricing is constrained by the sort of price-quality spectrum that I'm finding in the industry. And that's a competitor-based logic. You want to think about the market dynamics. So, for example, in technology markets, you have hardware markets. Say you have market dynamics that says prices are falling over time, sometimes very rapidly, and you really want to think about where you are in those price dynamics. And then, sort of the opposite picture is typically when you're coming into an industry, and by the way, I don't really recommend that as a strategy. You got to be careful with it. But many people come in at a low price. I don't have any customers. I'm competing against everybody else. Let me come in at a low price. Sometimes it's a terrible strategy because you're undervaluing yourself and you're sending the wrong signal to the market. In other cases, it's a reasonable strategy. But the point is you're basically figuring out the prices you're going to charge as a function of what the competition is, and then you say, well, my introductory price is going to be at a 20, 30% discount to that or something like that. These are all competitor-based logics. There is a sort of third logic that is worth being aware of, and it's sort of the constraints that are imposed by the value chain. So here I just sort of produced a simple value chain where we're thinking about whom are we selling to? Are we selling our product to a distributor? In which case, well, maybe this is, say, a $9 price. Or no, we're actually selling our product straight to the retailer because we're going to do the distribution. We're talking about a different price range. And that's completely different price range yet from being the retailer yourself and selling directly to consumers. And even there, don't be fooled by the suggested retail price because only a small fraction of customers actually pay the suggested retail price. So in building our pricing expectations, we have to be aware of these industry dynamics and get familiar with them. These are a bunch of tools that we can use to generate the prices that we're going to use. By far the most time, though, you're going to spend on trying to figure out estimating your quantities. How many units am I actually going to sell? And I'm going to give you 4 different techniques. And each of these techniques are reasonably practical. And in some businesses, some of them work better than others. In an ideal world, you're going to combine them all. But that doesn't always work. So the first step, before we do that, I think it's really useful to have this tiny little S-curve in mind. The S-curve, I think, is incredibly helpful for thinking about startups, and it's incredibly helpful to think about new versus established industries. What is it? It's basically a curve that says over time, the revenues of a, let's say, firm, you can do the same thing at the industry level, but at the firm level, are going to increase, but they tend to increase in an S-curve-like shape. Now, this is not a universal truth, but people who have studied industries and firms have found that there's a lot of truth to that, and there's some good reasons that basically in the beginning, things are very slow, and there's obviously a high uncertainty, which means a lot of companies just tank down here and they don't go anywhere. But of the ones that continue, you then sort of see a rapid growth phase, and then you see a slowing down growth phase in a mature market. So this is a startup, this is a growth company, and this is an established company. How you're going to do your financial projections is going to depend a lot on which of these three types of companies you are, a startup, growth, or mature. And the same is true whether you are in a new market, a growing market, or a mature market. Your financial projections are going to look different. And we're going to see this S-curve coming back in a moment because it's really a useful tool. So top-down. How we're going to do top-down revenue projections? Well, the idea, I'm going to give you an example in a moment, but I'll just give you quickly sort of a description of the method, is you're basically going to look not at your own business, but at the market. And you're going to try to say, this is something you have to do in your business plan anyway. Every investor that you're going to present to is going to say, how big is the market? And so you want to have an intelligent answer for that anyway. Well, that intelligent answer can then also be used for informing your financial projections. In an existing market, you can use secondary market data and say the market for fashion ties is X million of pounds. Why? Because I looked it up online. It's generally available information. That's the business I'm in. If you're in an emerging market, you can't really do that. That's where you're using the S-curve in order to sort of think about it and give a theoretical reasoning of why you think this thing that nobody's buying today will be a big hit in a few years. Now, classic mistakes. Everybody in China will buy my product. That's simply never true. The other thing, please, please, please never make that sentence. I only want 1% of the computer industry. It's meaningless. If you say that, I only want this tiny little fraction of this market. Well, 1% of the computer industry is ginormous, so it's not small. Just because it's 1% doesn't mean it's small. But it also means that if you only want 1% of the market, it means you don't understand your market. You have not segmented and categorized your market properly. Because if you had, then you should be dominating or play a more significant role in your niche. That's a classic mistake. Now, let me actually give you an example. This actually comes out of a Harvard case study where we have a company that's trying to give renal care treatment to patients in a sort of clinic fashion. And they want to do this, and it's a very interesting business idea. There's a real business behind this. It's now some years ago. And they want to introduce this concept into China, and they want to introduce this concept into Taiwan. And I just want to show you how people figure out market sizes on the basis of this example. The beauty of this is Taiwan is a mature market that's at the top of the S-curve. China at this time is at the bottom of the S-curve, not established market. So here's a couple of statistics that you can find. Population is now out of date. It's probably growing, by 1 million every year, several millions and millions every year. But at the time, basically, China had 1.2 billion people compared to 21 million in Taiwan. Now, this is the incidence rate of kidney failures, which is the symptom that we're treating. And we're basically going to assume that people in Taiwan and China have similar health. We could debate that, but we actually have data on the incidence rate in Taiwan, and so we're going to apply that to China. Classic trick. We understand one market. We're going to import the assumptions from one market into the market that we're interested in, say, China. So now we're going to get the number of people who have early-stage renal disease, which is basically the symptom that we want to treat. And we're going to say, well, here's really interesting. We're not in Taiwan. Taiwan's a very urban market. It's a very advanced healthcare system. We can treat everybody, more or less. So 100% coverage. That's never going to happen in China. So, the way we're going to offer these clinics, our target market is not all of China. It's not rural China. It's urban China. And this estimate was 30% of people live in urban China, depending on how you define it. So now we've narrowed down already the number of people that we're going to be able to treat. And then we're going to say, oh my God, not everybody can afford this. Well, Taiwan has complete health coverage, so everybody gets it. China, it's private health insurance. Only 30% of the people can actually afford it. So now we're going to be down to much lower numbers. We can charge 156 for a typical treatment session in Taiwan. We can charge a third of that in China. And then we figure out how often does our customer come in a year, and we can estimate the market. So now the annual revenue we're going to get per patient is calculated here, and based on this, we're actually calculating a market size. By the way, this is a great exercise to do, because what you're doing is you're starting with a very large market, and you're trying to figure out what is my relevant market. The mistake you should not do is to take the number that we have up here, which was basically 750,000 people, and say we're going to have a market of 150,000 people and treating them at, say, $53. Because the relevant market really shrank down to something much smaller, 67,000. What we're getting at the end of the day, though, is an estimate of the market size. And I've given you a little bit of detail with an example of how to get there. Now, we're going to use the second method. This is the top-down method, and you can see why I'm calling it top-down, because we're trying to understand the whole market, how much is out there. I have not talked yet about how much of that market I'm going to grab. So in these calculations, I'm not saying that I'm going to capture $268,000. I'm just saying there's a market of 268,000 and somebody's going to grab it. Okay, now bottom-up revenue projections is kind of the opposite logic. Top-down for you, for those economists in the room, is a demand-driven logic. Bottom-up is a supply-driven logic. So I'm basically going to think about what am I going to be able to deliver. I'm going to define my unit. We've done that already. I'm going to estimate the number of customers, multiply by the average price, estimate customer growth over time, and I'm basically focusing on what I think I am able to sell. So let me give you an example. This is some tasty, fast ceviche. This is a business plan of one of my students from a few years ago who thought that ceviche, delicious South American dish, fresh fish with some lemon, and they wanted to turn this into a fast food concept, basically. Great idea. It's a new restaurant concept. How would we figure out our revenues? Well, we start by saying, what's our revenue from a typical customer? So I turn it into pounds here. So let's say they're going to eat a ceviche, a side dish, and a drink, and we're going to offer that at 10 pounds. You know, probably too cheap, but number of customers and hours operations, well, you know, we may say at lunch we can serve 50 people, afternoon, very operational numbers that are going to give me some idea. Oh, well, this is really something that we're going to do. Their concept was to do it in near offices. This is sort of more appropriate for their business plan. So we're only open 5 days a week. That's going to have a huge impact on my revenue projection, whether I operate 5 or 7 days a week. But anyway, what you're doing is you're just counting up numbers. And in this particular case, you know, the estimate would come to just under 300,000 pounds of revenue. Now, is this the right number? I have no idea. I just made some assumptions about people coming to my restaurant. So, but I know I can't deliver a lot more because I just don't have the capacity for holding more than 50 people for lunch or the evening. That's a bottom-up logic. You want to be very careful here about how you ramp up revenue. So a classic mistake with a bottom-up approach is to assume that you're at full capacity from the start. You're not going to be at full capacity from the start. These calculations, for example, assume that my restaurant is operating at full scale right away. If I was more careful, then I would sort of build that up over time. Okay, so now I've given you two methods. I've given you a top-down, and I've given you a bottom-up. We're going to try to combine them, and the answer is basically the bottom-up should be well below the top-down. If the bottom-up, say, what you can do is you can calculate the market share. The bottom-up basically gives you what you think you're going to make. The top-down gives you what there is in the market. You divide one by the other, you get a market share. And so, you know, if you're somewhere, say, below 10%, then you're probably not aggressive enough. Maybe you should try to sell more of your product. If you're getting more, you know, say between 10.5%, 50% or something, maybe they're realistic, but you have to sort of have an argument. If you're getting above 50%, you have to say, am I really able to dominate this market? Am I going to be the biggest player in this market? If you're above 100%, you're clearly have a problem because you projected that your revenues are more than what the market's actually able to bear. Okay, I'll go quickly through the other ones. Copycats, what we can do in some businesses is we can compare ourselves to the industry and we can compare ourselves to our own past. This is mostly for more established businesses, so I'll sort of go quickly through one important insight. You use the S-curve. If you're just going to use your own past or what everybody else in the industry is doing, you're going to underestimate the early growth because you're basically doing a linear projection of what's already happening. You're going to overestimate your growth in the rapid growth phase. And it's only in established businesses that you're going to come up with a reasonable estimate looking at your own past. The point here is, established businesses, you can use your past growth rate, and that's probably not a bad predictor. Startups typically doesn't work.